The smell of gunpowder and polished leather filled the air, a signature scent of power and privilege at the elite marksman's club, where the wealthy gathered not just to shoot, but to show who they were. It wasn't merely a shooting range, it was a private kingdom, a fortress of reputation where only the best or the richest dared to tread. Here deals were sealed over targets hit at impossible distances, fortunes discussed between carefully timed shots, and egos flexed as loudly as the crack of high-caliber rounds. On this particular afternoon, the air thrummed with anticipation as Logan Carrington, the undisputed star of the club and the reigning national champion, stepped onto the main platform, his custom-built rifle gleaming under the overhead lights. Every movement he made was calculated, casual yet commanding, from the confident way he adjusted his grip to the easy smile he flashed at the onlookers. A sharp crack split the air as he fired, and when the target reeled back, a perfect bullseye sat dead center. Applause erupted, mingling with the low hum of admiration from a crowd dressed more for a gala than for a range. Logan gave a casual nod, his expression one of someone who expected no less. To him, and everyone gathered, the day was simply another coronation of his supremacy, another effortless display that kept his name in the mouths of sponsors and society's elite. It was a place where outsiders rarely crossed the threshold, and if they did, they rarely stayed. Everything about the club spoke of exclusivity, from the marble-tiled lobby to the personalized lockers lined with gold-plated name tags. The rifles on display behind glass cases cost more than most cars. The memberships, rumored to require not just money, but personal recommendations from at least 3 standing members, were even more valuable. Conversations floated through the air, clipped and amused, revolving around stock portfolios, yacht trips, and exclusive galas. The competition here was not just about shooting, it was about belonging to a world where wealth insulated you from ordinary life. And at the center of it all stood Logan, a man who had learned to shoot before he could ride a bike, whose family's fortune had opened every door, cleared every obstacle, and built the pedestal he now occupied so confidently. But fate often prefers to strike not with a roar, but with a whisper. And that afternoon, fate wore a simple pair of scuffed sneakers and a cardigan faded from too many washes. Without fanfare or announcement, Sarah Collins stepped across the polished threshold of the elite marksman's club, and for a few long seconds no one noticed. In a place obsessed with appearances, her modest clothes and unassuming manner rendered her practically invisible, a ghost moving through a sea of silk and designer tactical vests. She paused near the reception desk, holding a small, worn envelope that contained a day pass, a gift she hadn't expected and nearly hadn't used. Her hand tightened slightly around it as the receptionist, without even glancing up fully, dismissed her presence with a mechanical smile, the kind reserved for background noise. Around her, conversations continued, laughter echoed, the world spun on, perfectly indifferent to the woman who had just stepped into their kingdom, quietly altering the course of the day without anyone realizing it yet. At the far end of the room, Logan caught a glimpse of the newcomer and immediately smirked, nudging his companions to follow his gaze. It wasn't malice at first, just the casual cruelty of someone so secure in his superiority that mocking felt as natural as breathing. "Looks like the cleaning crew got lost," he murmured, loud enough for the people nearest to hear, setting off a ripple of laughter that spread faster than a dropped shell casing. Sarah heard it, of course. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes assessing her, dismissing her, judging her. But she didn't flinch. She had not come here for them, though she knew better than most what it was to stand in a room where you weren't welcome. Her steps were steady as she crossed the marble floor toward the beginner's lanes, head bowed not in submission but in quiet determination. She was here for a reason, one none of them could have imagined. A reason born not of pride or ambition, but of a promise, etched deep enough to withstand anything, even humiliation. And as she walked past the jeering crowd, unnoticed by all but the few who were already preparing to enjoy her inevitable failure, Sarah Collins carried with her the kind of quiet strength that history is built on, the kind no designer label, no gold-plated rifle, and no amount of applause could ever counterfeit. The moment Sarah reached the reception desk, it was as if the atmosphere around her solidified, thicker, colder, harder to move through. The young woman behind the marble counter glanced up, her eyes gliding over Sarah with a flicker of detached assessment, the way one might glance at an unexpected stain on a white tablecloth. In her finely tailored black uniform and polished nails, the receptionist looked as though she herself belonged to this world of quiet affluence, where appearances mattered more than reality and pedigree was judged before a single word was spoken. Sarah, by contrast, looked like she had wandered in by mistake. Her cardigan was stretched at the cuffs, her jeans plain and worn at the knees, and her shoes, sensible and scuffed, told stories of long walks and little money rather than designer boutiques. She cleared her throat softly, holding out the envelope with the day pass inside. "Excuse me," she said, her voice gentle but clear. "I'd like to register for today's open practice session." For a moment it seemed the receptionist might pretend she hadn't heard her at all. Then, with an almost imperceptible sigh, she extended a manicured hand, plucking the envelope with 2 fingers, as though wary of what it might contain. She opened it with exaggerated care, skimmed the pass, and offered a tight smile, the kind that didn't touch her eyes. "I'm sorry, but practice sessions are for members only," she said crisply, already reaching for a stack of neatly organized paperwork, as if dismissing Sarah from existence. Sarah's heart beat harder, but she stood her ground. "It's a valid pass," she said, tapping the envelope lightly. It was a gift. The receptionist hesitated, a flicker of annoyance crossing her perfect features. She examined the pass again, more closely this time, clearly hoping to find some technicality that would allow her to refuse entry. When she found none, she forced another brittle smile and typed something into her computer with sharp, impatient strokes. "One moment," she said, her voice clipped. As Sarah waited, she could feel the weight of the room bearing down on her, the polite glances that turned to smirks, the subtle whispers threading through the rich air. She was an intruder in their perfect little world, and everyone knew it. From across the grand hall, Logan Carrington leaned lazily against a glass display case, watching the scene unfold with thinly veiled amusement. He didn't need to hear what was being said. The posture, the awkwardness, the hesitations all told the story. To him, it was obvious. Some nobody, probably won a raffle or got a pity pass from a charity auction, stumbling into a place she had no right to be. His laughter was low, shared with the group of similarly dressed elites who flanked him like a royal court. They sipped imported coffee from sleek mugs and carried themselves with the casual arrogance of those who knew the world would never truly test them. Sarah finally received a small sticker and a range assignment, practically tossed across the counter, and a clipped instruction to proceed to the beginner lanes. She thanked the receptionist quietly, though it was clear no gratitude was expected or desired. Tucking the pass into her purse, she made her way deeper into the club, each step feeling heavier than the last. She passed gleaming trophies in glass cases, plaques bearing names of prestigious members, black and white photographs of men and women captured mid-shot, frozen in perfect moments of triumph. Everywhere she looked, she was reminded that this place was not designed for people like her. Logan watched her weave awkwardly through the grand hall, a shark sensing blood in the water. "Poor thing," he drawled loud enough for his entourage to hear, drawing more snickers. "Someone get her a map, or a knitting needle. Wrong club, sweetheart." More laughter followed, louder this time, emboldened by the collective sense of superiority. Logan's companions weren't bad people, not really, at least not in their own minds. They were simply so insulated by privilege that they mistook cruelty for humor, arrogance for confidence, dismissal for discernment. To them, Sarah wasn't a person. She was a momentary distraction, an easy punchline to liven up the afternoon before Logan inevitably shattered another record and collected another round of applause. Sarah heard them, of course, every word, every giggle. She let it wash over her like a bitter wind. There was a time when such scorn would have burned her, would have sent her retreating into the nearest corner to lick invisible wounds. But grief had tempered her. Loss had reforged her spirit in ways these people could never understand. Their judgment, their laughter, their smug smiles. It couldn't touch her where she had been broken and rebuilt. She reached the beginner's lane, found her assigned station at the very end of the row, a spot so far removed it might as well have been in another building. She set her bag down carefully on the narrow bench, methodically unzipping it to reveal a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. Behind her, Logan and his friends continued their show. Bets were being whispered now, light-hearted, mocking wagers about how quickly the stray cat would miss her first shot, how fast she would flee the embarrassment. A few even joked about calling security just to hurry the inevitable along. In their minds, this wasn't cruelty, it was sport, entertainment, and it never crossed their minds, not even for a second, that the woman they were laughing at might be the one they should be watching most closely. Sarah, still silent, still steady, began to unwrap the cloth from around her weapon. Every movement precise, every gesture deliberate. The room around her buzzed with ridicule and derision, but she moved through it as if it weren't even there. She wasn't here to prove anything to them. She wasn't here to change their minds. She was here for one reason and one reason alone, and soon the world inside this gleaming fortress of pride and pretense would never forget her. Logan Carrington straightened from his casual lean against the display case, brushing an imaginary speck of dust from the sleeve of his custom-fitted shooting jacket. His smirk widened as he watched Sarah carefully unwrap her weapon with a reverence that was almost laughable to him. Around him, his entourage gathered closer, the scent of expensive cologne and overconfidence thick in the air. A few of them exchanged gleeful glances, elbowing each other as if about to witness the opening act of a comedy show. To them, Sarah wasn't a competitor, she was a spectacle, an uninvited guest whose only role was to amuse. Logan relished moments like this, easy victories, unchallenged dominance, reminders that he was still untouchable in his domain. With an exaggerated sigh of boredom, he pushed off from the display and sauntered across the shooting hall toward the beginner's range, his every step a lazy declaration of superiority. "Excuse me, ma'am," Logan said as he arrived at Sarah's lane, his voice soaked with honeyed condescension. Several nearby patrons turned to watch, sensing the entertainment escalating. "Are you sure you're in the right place? This isn't a sewing circle, you know." His companions chuckled, emboldened by his arrogance, their laughter rolling through the otherwise serious atmosphere of the range. Sarah paused, the Glock still cradled in her hands, and slowly looked up at him. Her hazel eyes, clear and steady, met his piercing blue gaze without flinching, without apology. There was no anger in her expression, no sign of the embarrassment he had expected to see, just a calm, almost unsettling stillness. "I am just here to practice," she said quietly, her words neither defensive nor confrontational, simply factual, delivered with a confidence so subtle most missed it. But not Logan. For the briefest second, a tiny ripple of unease flickered through him, too small to register fully, but enough to deepen his smirk into something almost predatory. He straightened to his full height, towering slightly over her, and gestured grandly toward the distant targets. "Practice? Honey, this place is for real shooters. Tell you what," he said, turning slightly to address the growing crowd, playing to his audience with theatrical flair. "Let's make it interesting." He pulled a gleaming money clip from his jacket, peeled off a crisp bill, and waved it lazily between two fingers. 10,000 says you can't hit the bullseye from 50 yards. Right here, right now." Gasps and murmurs rose immediately from the spectators, some leaning closer to hear, others already fishing out their phones, sensing an event worth remembering. Sarah blinked once, slowly, then looked at the distance, then at Logan, and then back at her Glock with the same measured calm. "I don't have that kind of money to bet," she said simply, the hint of a smile almost touching her lips. Logan chuckled, the sound rich and derisive. "Oh, you won't need it," he drawled. "If, and that's a big if, you win, you get the money. If you lose, you just pack up and leave. Seems fair, doesn't it?" Sarah tilted her head slightly, considering, as if weighing something far heavier than money. Her hand brushed lightly against the simple gold ring on her finger, a gesture so natural, so deeply ingrained in her muscle memory that it passed unnoticed by most. To Logan, it was just another sign of uncertainty, another tell that he was firmly in control of this little scene he was orchestrating. But in reality, Sarah wasn't hesitating out of fear. She was remembering. She was hearing a voice that no longer belonged to the living, a voice that had once coached her through her first shaky rounds on an empty public range, a voice that had said, "You're steadier than you think. You just have to trust yourself when it counts." "All right," Sarah said at last, the single word falling between them like a quiet challenge. Logan's smirk sharpened into a full, wolfish grin. He turned to the growing crowd, flourishing his arms as if announcing a grand performance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, "we have ourselves a little show. Gather round. You won't want to miss this." People moved closer, forming a loose semicircle around the beginner's range, whispers spreading like wildfire. Bets were being placed openly now, with Logan's name invariably on the winning side. No one seriously thought Sarah could do it. No one even considered the possibility. She was nobody, a civilian, an outsider, someone who didn't belong among the polished floors, gleaming trophies and manicured egos of the elite marksman's club. At the far end of the shooting hall, Rebecca Hart, the club's operations manager and a former competitive shooter herself, watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of discomfort. She didn't know the woman standing at lane 12, but she knew bullying when she saw it, no matter how well it was disguised under smiles and good-natured wagers. She considered stepping in, but the social current of the club was a powerful thing, and Logan Carrington, heir to a family fortune and holder of 5 national titles, was not someone whose path you crossed lightly. Rebecca folded her arms across her chest and watched in silence, hoping, praying against reason, that somehow this would not end the way everyone expected. Logan leaned casually against the partition between lanes, arms crossed, already savoring the victory he believed was moments away. "Whenever you're ready," he said smoothly, his tone making it clear he wasn't in a rush. Sarah took one last deep breath, her fingers tightening briefly on the grip of her Glock. The weight of the gun was familiar, almost comforting. She closed out the noise around her, the snickers, the whispers, the shallow pity, until all that remained was the lane stretching out before her, the distant target, and the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. Logan's laughter was still ringing in the air when she lifted the Glock and took aim with a steadiness that spoke of something far deeper than mere practice. A stillness settled over her, not the brittle kind that shatters under pressure, but the deep, enduring stillness of someone who had faced storms far worse than public ridicule and come through stronger. As her finger moved to the trigger, Sarah Collins was no longer the awkward outsider fumbling for acceptance. She was something else entirely, something Logan Carrington had never encountered in all his years at the top, a challenger he didn't see coming. The hush that fell over the elite marksman's club was almost sacred, a dense, charged silence that wrapped around the gathering crowd as Sarah adjusted her stance. It was a silence of anticipation, of amusement for some, of dismissive curiosity for others, but not a single soul present believed they were about to witness anything remarkable. They waited with the kind of expectation you reserve for a predictable ending, the stumble of an amateur, the inevitable embarrassment, a scene that would be laughed about over cocktails for weeks to come. Logan leaned back against the lane divider, his arms crossed, a smug smile playing on his lips as he nodded indulgently toward the distant target. In his mind, this moment was already over. A good chuckle, maybe a few half-hearted claps for sportsmanship, and then the woman would leave, Probably red-faced, maybe even teary-eyed, certainly wiser about venturing into places she didn't belong. It never crossed his mind that she might actually pose a threat. How could she? Everything about her screamed out of place, unqualified, outmatched. Sarah's hands moved with a calm that was almost eerie in the highly charged room. She checked the Glock's magazine, ensured the chamber was properly loaded, and exhaled slowly, centering herself. The voices in the background blurred and then faded completely as she focused on what was real. The target ahead, the solid feel of the pistol's grip, the memory of steady hands guiding hers years ago on quieter, lonelier ranges, where there had been no audience, no applause, just the steady pursuit of competence, the slow forging of skill through repetition and trust. Trust in the weapon, trust in herself, trust in the lessons she had been given. Her late husband's voice echoed in her mind, calm and sure. Breathe, focus, let the shot happen. You don't force it, you let it happen. Logan's voice cut through the quiet like a knife, sharp and mocking. Any time today, sweetheart, don't want you pulling a muscle. His companions chuckled again, but even their laughter seemed thinner now, more strained, as if some deep, unconscious part of them sensed something shifting. Sarah ignored him. She raised the Glock, locked her elbows, adjusted her stance minutely, and found the sight picture. Her breathing slowed. The world narrowed to a point. 50 yards was a long way for a handgun shot, especially under pressure, especially for someone who was expected to fail. But Sarah didn't feel pressure. She felt clarity. The shot broke the silence like a whip crack, a single sharp report, clean and decisive, slicing through the thick, expectant air. The recoil was absorbed easily by her practiced stance. She lowered the Glock slightly, breathing out steadily as she hit the button to retrieve the target. The mechanical hum of the retrieval system seemed to drag on forever, each second stretching taut as a wire. Conversations stilled. Logan's smirk faltered ever so slightly, though he quickly masked it behind a laugh, nudging his closest friend in the ribs. "Here it comes," he murmured, already preparing to gloat. The target inched closer. First the outer edges appeared, untouched. Then the inner rings, unmarred. And finally, dead center, as pristine and undeniable as a sunrise, was a single, perfect hole right through the middle of the bullseye. For one heartbeat, 2, 3, the entire room froze. Disbelief hung in the air like smoke. Logan's laugh died in his throat, replaced by a tight, forced chuckle that sounded painfully loud in the unnatural stillness. His companions looked at one another, suddenly unsure whether to cheer or stay silent. The receptionist from the front desk, who had barely glanced at Sarah when she entered, stared openly now, her mouth slightly open in astonishment. Sarah didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply placed the Glock gently back onto the counter in front of her, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she had done nothing more unusual than tying a shoe. Her hands were steady, her face unreadable. If she felt any surge of triumph, any spike of satisfaction at the stunned faces around her, she gave no sign. She had not come for their approval, and she did not need their astonishment to validate her. Logan stepped forward, snatching the target with a sharp motion, inspecting it closely as though the paper itself might reveal some trick. His fingers traced the perfect hole in the center. No tears, no fraying, just a clean puncture that spoke of skill and precision few could match. He cleared his throat and tossed the target down onto the counter with exaggerated nonchalance. "Beginner's luck," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Anyone can get lucky once." His voice was light, but a muscle twitched at his jawline, betraying the anger starting to churn beneath the surface. Sarah simply nodded, as if acknowledging an unimportant observation, and began to gather her things. She had no intention of lingering, but Logan wasn't about to let the story end here. His pride, wounded deeper than he cared to admit, demanded restitution. He stepped closer, crowding her personal space slightly, his voice dropping low enough for only a few to hear. "One shot proves nothing," he said, a dangerous glint lighting in his eyes. How about we really find out if that was luck or something else? He turned to the crowd again, his showman instincts kicking in, desperation masked as bravado. "Let's raise the stakes," he called out, grinning wide. 3 bullseyes, 75 yards, double or nothing, $50,000 if you pull it off. If you miss even one, you leave, and you admit it was all a fluke. Gasps and excited murmurs rippled through the audience. Phones reappeared. This wasn't just a sideshow anymore. It was quickly becoming the event of the month, the kind of story people would tell again and again. Logan was daring the impossible, and everyone was certain he would be the one walking away with his dominance reasserted. Sarah stood still for a moment, her bag half-zipped, her mind weighing the consequences. She hadn't come for any of this. She hadn't come for a public challenge, for spectacle, for confrontation. She had come for something much quieter, something personal and sacred. But now the path had changed. Now it wasn't just about honoring a promise, it was about standing her ground, about not letting the world push her back into the shadows where it thought she belonged. She looked up at Logan, her hazel eyes calm, steady, and in that stillness she saw the flicker of uncertainty in his. "All right," she said quietly, "on one condition." Logan arched an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "If I win, the $50,000 doesn't go to me," she continued. "It goes to the Veterans Support Foundation." There was a beat of silence before Logan barked a laugh. "Fine," he said, shrugging grandly. "It's not like you'll win anyway." The crowd buzzed with fresh excitement. A simple woman against the champion, a nobody against the king, a wager that was more than just money, a battle for pride, for respect, for something that most of them would never truly understand. As Sarah moved to take her place at the 75-yard mark, the energy in the room shifted again, heavier now, as if the air itself recognized that something far more important than money was about to unfold. As Sarah moved toward the far end of the range, the world around her seemed to slow. The murmur of voices, the shifting of feet, even the clink of spent shells hitting the floor faded into a dull, distant hum. She was vaguely aware of the crowd thickening, more members abandoning their own practice stations to watch, sensing that something unexpected, something rare, was unfolding before their eyes. But she didn't let herself focus on them, their opinions, their expectations, their whispers. None of it mattered. What mattered was the feel of the weapon in her hand, the rhythm of her breath, the lessons etched so deeply into her bones that even grief hadn't managed to erase them. As she reached her new mark, she placed the Glock carefully down on the small table provided and flexed her fingers once, subtly shaking out the tension that had started to build in her forearms. In the quiet of her own mind, she returned to another range, long ago, smaller and dustier, far from the polished marble and glass of the elite marksman's club. She remembered standing under the wide-open sky, the Vermont wind tugging at her hair, her husband's voice in her ear, low, patient, steady. Nathan had been her anchor, her mentor, her fiercest advocate. "Shooting isn't about strength," he had told her once, adjusting her elbow gently with his rough, calloused hand. "It's about control, about mastering yourself so completely that the world outside you can't touch what's inside." Nathan had taught her that a real shooter didn't just fire a weapon, they became part of it. The breath, the body, the trigger, all extensions of a singular focus, a singular purpose. He had taught her not to fight the pressure, but to lean into it, to let it sharpen her senses rather than cloud them. In those long afternoons, she had learned to let the noise fall away until there was only the shot. And as she stood now at 75 yards, the echoes of his lessons wrapped around her like armor. Meanwhile, Logan watched from behind, arms crossed tightly, his easy arrogance beginning to fray at the edges. He wasn't worried yet, not really. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it itched at him, an irritant he couldn't quite ignore. He had seen amateurs get lucky shots before. Even broken clocks were right twice a day. But 3 bullseyes at this distance, that wasn't luck. That would take something more, something he had spent his whole life believing couldn't possibly reside in anyone outside of his carefully curated world. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder as Sarah prepared her first shot. Some voices were amused, others skeptical, but a very few, carried a different tone, something closer to curiosity, closer to hope. Rebecca Hart stood near the back, arms folded tightly across her chest, feeling a strange tension pulling at her. She didn't know who Sarah was, didn't know her story, but she recognized that kind of focus when she saw it. It wasn't something you could fake. It wasn't the swaggering bravado Logan wore like a second skin. It was something quieter, something stronger. Sarah settled into position, the Glock an extension of her arm. Her feet found their natural placement, shoulder-width apart, weight balanced evenly. She aligned her sights, breathed in deep and slow, then exhaled halfway and froze, suspended in that perfect, razor-sharp moment between breath and action. Her finger squeezed the trigger with practiced control. The shot cracked across the range, sharp and decisive. The onlookers tracked the sound instinctively, heads snapping toward the target system as it reeled back on its mechanical rails. Another bullseye, dead center. The murmurs shifted, turning uneasy. Logan stiffened, his jaw tightening. It was one thing to land a single lucky shot. Two in a row, at increasing difficulty, began to hint at something else entirely. Sarah didn't celebrate. She didn't even acknowledge the gasps and low exclamations rippling through the room. She simply recentered herself, cleared her mind, and prepared for the second shot. If anything, her movements became even more economical, more precise. She shifted her stance minutely, recalibrating for the slight fatigue she knew would start to creep into her muscles, her breathing slowing to a steady, controlled rhythm. The second shot rang out, and the impact was immediate. Another perfect hole, slightly overlapping the first. The room erupted in a cacophony of reactions: shock, admiration, disbelief. Phones now recorded openly, capturing every second. People who had mocked her only moments ago leaned forward, trying to catch every detail of her technique, suddenly desperate to understand how this unknown woman was doing what seasoned competitors had struggled to achieve. Logan moved closer to the shooting lane, his face a rigid mask of control. His confidence had not just been shaken, it had been cracked. He muttered something to one of his companions, who merely shrugged helplessly. The energy in the room was shifting fast now, sliding away from Logan's gravity, pulled inexorably toward Sarah, toward the silent, steady force she had become. Sarah allowed herself a single deep breath before her final shot. Her thumb brushed lightly over the gold band on her finger, the familiar motion grounding her, reminding her why she was here. Not for pride, not for applause, for a promise, for Nathan, for herself. She raised the Glock one final time, and as the third shot cracked through the charged silence, a kind of stillness fell over the room. A collective breath held by every person present, as if even the air itself was waiting to see if what they thought impossible was about to happen. The target reeled back one last time. 3 shots, 3 perfect bullseyes. The crowd erupted, spontaneous, unrestrained, roaring with disbelief and awe. Cheers mixed with shouts, with frantic conversations as people tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Even Rebecca found herself clapping before she realized what she was doing, her professional detachment forgotten in the face of such a stunning performance. Logan stood frozen, hands clenched at his sides, his face drained of color. Around him, the crowd's center of gravity had shifted completely, no longer orbiting him, no longer held in awe of his easy charm and manufactured perfection. They were looking at Sarah now, and they were seeing her not as an intruder, not as a joke, but as something rare and undeniable. Sarah placed the Glock down gently once again, zipped her bag, and straightened. She didn't bow, she didn't wave. She simply stood there, quiet and composed, letting the storm of reactions swirl around her without being pulled in. Logan approached her stiffly, trying to force his face into something resembling graciousness. But before he could speak, Before he could spin this into a moment he could salvage, Sarah turned toward him, her voice calm, her gaze steady. "You said it was luck," she said simply. "Maybe you should reconsider." She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. She had already said everything that mattered, not with words, but with 3 perfect, impossible shots that shattered the invisible walls they had tried to build around her. As she walked away, the crowd parted for her like the Red Sea, silence trailing in her wake, followed by a stunned, growing respect that even Logan Carrington couldn't laugh away. The moment the final bullseye appeared on the target, the room seemed to fracture. For a few long, suspended seconds, the sound of the shot still echoed faintly against the high ceilings, and no one spoke, no one moved. Sarah remained perfectly still, her Glock resting safely on the table before her, her shoulders relaxed, her hands steady at her sides. She didn't look around, didn't seek approval or applause. Her focus had never been on the crowd. She was here for something much larger than them, something they couldn't even begin to understand. Yet even those who had dismissed her, who had laughed openly just moments before, now felt the gravity shift around her. People who had built their lives around being the best, the wealthiest, the most untouchable, suddenly found themselves grappling with the uncomfortable realization that none of those things could conjure the kind of performance they had just witnessed. In the silence, admiration warred with disbelief, pride clashed with shame. Slowly, like a ripple traveling across a pond, the first few claps began. Hesitant, uncertain, as though acknowledging what had just happened might also require admitting how wrong they had been. Then more joined in, louder, fuller, until the room erupted into spontaneous applause that filled the cavernous space and bounced off the walls like a drumbeat of reluctant respect. Sarah stood through it all with the same quiet grace, not soaking in the attention, but simply accepting it as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Her eyes softened briefly, and she allowed herself one small glance down at the gold ring on her hand, tracing it lightly with her thumb. This moment was not for the crowd, not even for herself. It was for the man who had once believed in her when no one else even noticed. Nathan would have smiled that lopsided smile of his, the one he reserved for when she surprised him, when she surpassed even his high expectations. In her mind, she could almost hear him now, a warm murmur against the noise. "Told you, Collins. You're better than you know." Across the hall, Logan Carrington stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief barely hiding the rage boiling underneath. His hand was still outstretched from where he'd attempted a handshake that Sarah had simply walked past. Around him, the applause wasn't for him. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in his life within these walls, Logan wasn't the gravitational center of the room. He wasn't the sun around which everyone orbited. He had been eclipsed by a woman whose name he hadn't even bothered to learn before challenging her, and that realization burned hotter than any defeat he'd suffered in sanctioned competitions. Still, he wasn't ready to surrender his pride. Logan snatched the 3 targets from the bench with a sharp movement, holding them up for inspection. He studied the holes as if searching for evidence of tampering, anything to discredit what he was seeing. The precision was maddening, perfect, tight groupings that even he, with all his years of professional training, would have been proud to claim. His stomach twisted. He turned abruptly, facing the gathering crowd, forcing a hollow laugh. "Beginner's luck," he said again, but this time his voice cracked slightly at the edges, exposing the strain he was desperately trying to hide. "Anyone can get lucky 3 times. It was a weak defense, and he knew it. Even as the words left his mouth, he could feel them falling flat, limp, and unconvincing. People weren't laughing with him anymore. They were watching, evaluating, some even pitying. For a man like Logan, that sting was worse than losing. Before Logan could attempt to salvage more of his crumbling reputation, Rebecca Hart, who had been watching carefully from the sidelines, stepped forward. There was no applause from her, only a quiet, professional nod as she approached Sarah. "That was exceptional," she said, her voice steady. carrying just enough volume for the surrounding onlookers to hear. "Ms. Collins, is it?" Sarah met Rebecca's gaze and nodded once. "Sarah Collins," she confirmed, her tone polite but firm. Rebecca offered a hand, and this time Sarah accepted it. The handshake was brief but sincere, a quiet recognition between two women who understood the battlefield of subtle wars fought without words. "If you're interested," Rebecca continued, her voice dropping just slightly, "we have facilities for advanced shooters. I think you'd find it more appropriate than the beginner's lane." She said it loud enough that others heard, a subtle rebuke to the treatment Sarah had endured earlier. Before Sarah could answer, Logan's voice sliced through the gathering. "Hold on," he barked, stepping closer, his anger no longer hidden behind a smile. "One exhibition doesn't make you a professional. Let's see you keep it up under real pressure." His blue eyes gleamed with the feverish edge of someone desperate to regain control. He wasn't just looking to win anymore. He was looking to humiliate, to punish, to destroy whatever had just cracked the foundations of his carefully curated image. The crowd stirred, sensing the escalation, their murmurs sharpening into excited whispers. Another challenge. Another chance to see the impossible. Logan pulled out a pen and a leather-bound checkbook from his inner jacket pocket, a theatrical move designed to show just how casually he treated $50,000. $50,000, he said, his voice loud and ringing in the hush that followed. 3 bullseyes again, but this time at 75 yards, and then 100. Real stakes, real difficulty. Sarah regarded him for a long, still moment. She understood exactly what was happening. Logan wasn't offering a fair competition. He was setting a trap, a spectacle designed to grind her down until the audience would forget what they had just witnessed. And yet, as she looked at him, she saw something else too. Beneath the bluster, beneath the condescension, there was fear, deep, gnawing fear that his world was changing in ways he couldn't control. "I didn't come here to prove anything to you," she said finally, her voice low and steady, cutting through the rising tension like a blade. "But if you want to make another wager—" She paused, and a ripple went through the crowd, leaning in, breathless. "If I win again, you pay the full amount, not to me, but to the Veterans Support Foundation." There was a beat of silence. Logan hesitated, visibly, the weight of what he was agreeing to hanging heavy in the air. But pride, as it always did, won out. He sneered and scribbled his signature onto the check, slapping it onto the counter between them. "Deal," he snapped, "but when you lose, you walk out of here and never show your face again." Sarah inclined her head, her composure unbroken. "Deal." As she turned back toward the range, a low murmur of excitement built behind her. She didn't need to look to know that eyes were following her every move now, but not with ridicule, with awe, with curiosity, with something dangerously close to hope. And Logan Carrington, still standing by the table with the check burning a hole in his hand, felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Fear of losing not just a competition, but the image of himself he had spent his entire life building. Sarah stood again at the line, but the atmosphere around her was no longer the same. Before, the weight she carried had been the cold indifference of strangers, the snickers of people certain she would fail. Now the air was electric, humming with an undercurrent of tension so thick you could almost taste it. Conversations had dwindled into whispered fragments, and every set of eyes in the Grand Elite Marksmen's Club, the millionaires, the old money heirs, the corporate titans, were focused solely on her. She felt their scrutiny pressing against her skin, but it didn't break her. If anything, it only clarified her purpose. In front of her lay the new challenge, a shot from 75 yards, and then a final shot from 100 yards, distances that separated casual shooters from true marksmen. The margin for error was razor-thin. At that range, the slightest tremor, the tiniest miscalculation, the briefest lapse of focus could send the bullet veering wildly off course. For most, it wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible, and that was exactly what Logan was counting on. He leaned casually against a nearby pillar, arms crossed, one foot resting behind the other like a man utterly confident of the outcome. To him, this wasn't just a bet anymore. This was about dominance, about reasserting the natural order he had always believed himself to sit atop. Sarah could feel his stare boring into her back as she methodically checked her weapon once again. She didn't rush. She didn't let the bait of the crowd's impatience tug at her. Every movement was deliberate, honed from years of practice. She knew the terrain better than any of them realized. Logan thought he had dragged her into deeper waters where she would drown. He didn't realize that Sarah Collins had already lived through worse storms than anything this club could throw at her. She tightened her stance, planted her feet with the unconscious ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. She aligned her body, her mind sharpening down to a single point of focus. Everything else, the crowd, the stakes, even Logan himself, faded into background noise. It was just her, the weapon, and the target. She could hear Nathan's voice in her memory as clearly as if he were standing beside her. It's not you against the others. It's you against yourself. Breathe, focus, trust. Sarah inhaled deeply, felt the breath expand her ribs, then exhaled slowly, deliberately, letting the world shrink to a pinprick around her sights. She squeezed the trigger with the practiced gentleness of someone turning a key in a delicate lock. The shot rang out, sharp and certain. The target retrieval system whirred to life, bringing the paper slowly, teasingly back toward the crowd. People leaned forward unconsciously, some holding their breath. When the target arrived, the evidence was clear. A single hole punched dead center into the bullseye. Perfect, clean, undeniable. The gasp that followed was almost unanimous, an inhalation of disbelief so collective it seemed to draw the walls closer around them. Even Logan's face cracked for an instant, a flicker of something raw, not anger, not yet, but genuine fear. He masked it quickly, but it was too late. Those closest to him saw it, and in that tiny moment, power began to slip from his fingers. Sarah didn't pause to celebrate. There was still the final shot to take, and she knew better than to assume anything was over until it truly was. She adjusted the sight, compensated for the greater distance, and shifted her weight ever so slightly. At 100 yards, variables multiplied. Humidity, air pressure, even the subtlest breeze that couldn't be felt by human skin could deflect a bullet enough to miss the mark. But she didn't fight these factors. She adapted, flowing around them like water around rocks. Nathan had taught her that too. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, shutting out everything, feeling only the rhythm of her pulse, the slow push and pull of her breathing. Then she opened them again, steadier than ever, and took the shot. The sound was different this time, or maybe it only seemed that way, crisper, purer. It cut through the heavy silence like a blade, leaving a deep, resonant stillness in its wake. The target retrieval moved so slowly it felt almost cruel, stretching out the suspense until the tension in the room became almost unbearable. People shifted on their feet, craned their necks. Even Rebecca Hart, who had trained herself never to show emotion on the range floor, found herself gripping the hem of her blazer so tightly her knuckles whitened. Finally, the target arrived, and there it was, another perfect hole, centered so precisely it might as well have been drawn there by a machine. For a moment, no one reacted. It was too much, too unexpected, too far beyond the reality they thought they knew. A woman in department store jeans, with a plain Glock, had just achieved a feat most seasoned competitors would hesitate to attempt under tournament conditions, and she had done it with a calmness that bordered on supernatural. And then the sound broke over the crowd, a roar of applause, louder and more sincere than before, not polite, not obligatory, but born from something deeper, respect, awe, wonder. Sarah stood there quietly as it washed over her, her face unreadable, but inside a small flame burned steady and bright, not pride, but something purer. Fulfillment. She had kept her promise. She had honored the man who had taught her everything. She had reclaimed a piece of herself that grief had tried to steal. Logan, meanwhile, was unraveling. His smile, the one that had carried him through countless competitions and photo ops, had vanished completely. In its place was a rictus of barely suppressed fury. He stormed forward, grabbing the targets roughly, inspecting them as if he might find some flaw, some trick, some way to invalidate what the entire room had just witnessed. But there was nothing. No gimmick, no deceit. Only raw, undeniable skill. "You got lucky," he said, his voice low and dangerous, pitched just for Sarah to hear. "Luck runs out." Sarah met his glare evenly. "Skill doesn't." Around them, the world shifted. Loyalties realigned, respect rebalanced. In the span of 2 shots, Sarah had overturned the carefully ordered hierarchy of the elite marksman's club, and nothing Logan said or did would change that now. His kingdom had cracked, his throne had shaken, and Sarah Collins, the woman no one had even bothered to notice when she first walked through the door, had not just challenged the king. She had dethroned him, one perfect shot at a time. The aftermath of the final shot rippled through the elite marksman's club like a seismic wave. Conversations erupted into stunned, animated bursts. Strangers who had barely acknowledged each other's existence suddenly leaning in close, exchanging frantic words, shaking their heads in disbelief. The energy in the room was unlike anything the club had ever seen, raw, electric, and completely outside the control of those who normally dictated its flow. Sarah Collins had not just hit her mark, she had shattered an illusion that had been carefully constructed over years. She had shown, without saying a word, that true excellence had nothing to do with status, wealth, or reputation. It was something quieter, deeper, something that could not be bought or faked. And that truth left a lot of very powerful people suddenly feeling very, very small. Sarah stood quietly at her station, her bag packed, her Glock secured. She had no grand speech to give, no gesture to claim the spotlight. She had never wanted the spotlight in the first place. Her success was not a performance, it was a private victory made public only by circumstance. She thought about slipping away, disappearing back into the city, into her simple life, leaving the club and its crumbling pretenses behind her. But as she moved toward the exit, the crowd instinctively parted before her, not out of disdain this time, but out of a new, reluctant reverence. Heads turned. Conversations quieted. In that moment, Sarah realized that no matter how quietly she had walked into this place, she was leaving it as something it would never forget. Logan Carrington, meanwhile, stood motionless near the center of the range, his hands curled into tight fists at his sides. Around him, the laughter he was used to commanding had turned against him, thinning into awkward whispers and sidelong glances. He had been humiliated, and worse, he had been exposed. Without the easy win he had expected, without the adoring affirmation he had taken for granted, Logan found himself isolated, a king without a kingdom, a champion without an audience. His mind raced for something, anything, that could undo the damage. Excuses piled up inside him like kindling, desperate to ignite. She cheated, the equipment was rigged, the sun was in his eyes, but none of them would survive the scrutiny of what everyone had just seen with their own eyes. Still, pride is a stubborn beast. He couldn't walk away, not yet, not while there was even a sliver of a chance to reclaim the ground he had lost. Logan straightened his shoulders, smoothed his expression into something resembling civility, and strode forward. He stopped just a few feet from Sarah, his smile stretched too tight, his voice pitched to carry across the gathering crowd. "Impressive shooting," he said, forcing a chuckle. "Impressive for an amateur." There it was, the bait, the last desperate attempt to frame her victory as a fluke, to remind the audience who the real professional was supposed to be. Sarah regarded him with a calm, steady gaze, the kind that had already dismantled him without lifting a hand. "Funny," she said quietly, but her voice carried, slicing through the murmuring crowd. "You seem very concerned for someone who thinks this was just luck." A few soft chuckles broke out nearby, not mocking her, but aimed squarely at Logan. his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles stood out like cords beneath his skin. "How about a real challenge, then?" Logan said sharply, his voice rising with a forced joviality that fooled no one. "A proper competition, 10 stations, varying distances, club-provided firearms, no excuses, no personal equipment. You and me. Winner takes the pot." The crowd murmured louder now, sensing the drama escalating even further. 10 stations. It was the format used in professional tournaments, designed to test a shooter's versatility, their ability to adapt quickly to different weapons and conditions. It was a bold move, but it wasn't made from confidence. It was made from panic. Logan was hoping that across 10 different challenges, he could outpace her, force mistakes, drown her precision in the sheer chaos of varied skill tests. Sarah didn't react immediately. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Part of her recoiled at the thought. She hadn't come here to engage in some petty battle of egos. She hadn't come here to strip crowns from kings or to shatter reputations. She had come to keep a promise, to reconnect with a part of herself that had been buried under grief. Yet, as she looked at Logan, at his sneering face, at the arrogance still clinging to him even as the walls crumbled, she realized that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, belittled. It was about showing that real skill didn't announce itself with grandstanding or gold-plated rifles. It simply, quietly endured. Sarah gave a small nod. "1 week from today," she said. "Same stakes. If I win, all proceeds go to the Veteran Support Foundation. And if you win—" She shrugged lightly. "You get to keep pretending you were never afraid." The audience gasped, some openly laughing now, though it wasn't cruel laughter anymore. It was the liberating kind, the kind that bursts free when a spell is broken. Logan's face flushed deep red, but he couldn't back down, not without losing whatever tattered dignity he had left. He forced another smile, his teeth bared more than bared pleasantly. "Deal," he snapped. As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement about the upcoming showdown, Rebecca Hart approached Sarah once more. She waited until they were out of easy earshot before speaking. "That was brave," she said, her voice low, edged with both admiration and concern. "But be careful. Logan's not used to losing, and he doesn't lose gracefully." Sarah nodded. She knew. She could see it already in the set of Logan's jaw, the glint of barely restrained fury in his eyes. But it didn't matter. She wasn't doing this for him. She wasn't doing this for the crowd. She was doing this because sometimes the world needed to be reminded, not with banners or declarations, but with simple, undeniable truth, that quiet strength could be louder than any roar. As Sarah gathered her things and made her way to the parking lot, she felt the weight of the day settle on her shoulders, but it wasn't a burden. It was a mantle, worn not with pride, but with purpose. Somewhere above her, the last rays of the afternoon sun pierced through the clouds, lighting the way ahead. And for the first time in a very long time, Sarah Collins didn't feel invisible at all. News of the showdown between Sarah Collins and Logan Carrington spread through the elite circles of Boston faster than wildfire. Within hours, whispers filled country clubs, executive lounges, and high-end cafes, carried with a mixture of excitement, disbelief, and amusement. Everyone had their version of the story. The unknown woman who walked into the most prestigious shooting club in the state and, with a quiet defiance, shattered the unshakable image of a champion. Some called her reckless, some called her lucky, but most simply called her the challenger, and by the following morning, even people outside the shooting world knew her name. She had gone from an invisible outsider to the subject of speculation, admiration, and scrutiny, all without ever having asked for any of it. Sarah, however, ignored the growing storm. She returned to her modest apartment overlooking a quiet street lined with maple trees and spent the next day in silent reflection, the distant noise of the city outside barely touching her. She wasn't preparing press releases or crafting a public image like Logan surely was. She was rereading Nathan's notes, flipping through the worn pages of the small journal he had once kept tucked inside his gear. Inside were fragments of wisdom, shooting drills, breathing techniques, handwritten diagrams of wind correction calculations, but also softer things. Reminders written to himself: stay patient, trust your gut. Pressure reveals who you are, not who you pretend to be. She read those words over and over, letting them anchor her against the rising tide of attention. Meanwhile, Logan Carrington was unraveling behind the closed doors of his penthouse suite, perched high above the Charles River, the skyline of Boston sprawling beneath him like a conquered city. The furniture was sleek and expensive, the kind of place designed more for appearances than for comfort. Logan paced across the marble floors, phone pressed tightly to his ear, barking orders at his private investigator. "I want everything you can find on her," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to slice glass. "Where she learned to shoot, who trained her, if she even owns that Glock legally. I don't care how you get it. Just find me something I can use." The investigator's voice on the other end was careful, professionally neutral. "Mr. Carrington, she's clean. No criminal record, no competitive shooting history, no red flags. She's just normal." That single word, normal, infuriated Logan more than anything else. In his world, greatness came from lineage, training, reputation carefully sculpted over decades. It didn't come from nowhere. It certainly didn't come from someone with second-hand clothes and an off-the-shelf sidearm. "Nobody's that good without training," he hissed. "Dig deeper, focus on her past, where she lived before Boston." In the following days, as the buzz grew louder, Logan's frustration mounted. Sponsors called, reporters sniffed around for interviews, and his advisors grew increasingly uneasy. He smiled for the cameras when necessary, giving polished, empty statements about welcoming new talent and respecting all competitors. But inside he was a boiling cauldron of resentment and fear. Sarah's existence wasn't just a threat to his record. It was a threat to his narrative, the image he had built with painstaking effort and ruthless protection. If she beat him again, there would be no coming back. His reign would crumble into a footnote, and so, as the public saw a poised, grinning champion graciously accepting a challenge, behind closed doors, Logan was plotting, scheming, desperately searching for ways to tip the scales back in his favor. Sarah, oblivious to the full extent of Logan's desperation, continued her preparations with a quiet intensity. She spent long hours at a public range far from the city, honing not just her marksmanship, but her ability to transition between different weapons. Nathan's notes became her Bible, and her old habits returned quickly: grip adjustments, breath control, trigger discipline, sight alignment. She worked through every possible scenario Logan might throw at her, not because she needed to win for the sake of winning, but because she understood what this had become. It was no longer just a personal promise, it was a test, a final, public reminder of everything Nathan had believed about her and everything she had worked so hard to reclaim. By the fourth day, Sarah noticed subtle shifts around her. Strangers began showing up at the range, men who watched a little too closely, who loitered near her lane pretending to check their gear, who made polite, seemingly harmless conversation about her background and training. She recognized them for what they were: scouts, hired hands sent to gather information. She responded with the same calm detachment she had learned during the hardest years of her life. Answer little, reveal nothing, stay focused. The night before the scheduled competition, a knock sounded at her door. She hesitated for a moment before opening it to find Michael Reeves standing there, an old friend of Nathan's, a man whose presence immediately set her at ease. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a seasoned veteran, but his eyes were serious, watchful. "You're causing quite the stir, you know," he said with a small smile as he stepped inside. Sarah laughed softly, the sound tinged with disbelief. "Not exactly what I had in mind." Michael shrugged. "Funny thing about storms, you don't always get to pick when they find you, only how you face them." He glanced at the kitchen table where Nathan's journal lay open. His face softened. "He'd be damn proud of you, Collins. Proud as hell." She didn't trust herself to speak, only nodded as emotion tightened her throat. Michael grew serious again. "Listen, Logan's not going to fight fair. I've heard things. Rule changes, equipment substitutions, tricks with the scoring." Sarah met his gaze evenly. "I figured," she said. "Doesn't matter. I'm ready." Michael hesitated before speaking again. "You're not alone in this. Nathan's friends, my friends, will be there, watching, making sure if you win, it's because you earned it. And if he cheats, he'll have a lot more to answer for than just bruised pride." Sarah felt the old network wrapping around her again, invisible but solid, a bond stronger than contracts, forged by loyalty and shared loss. Later that night, Sarah stood out on her small balcony, the cool air brushing against her skin, the city lights flickering like distant stars. She thought of everything that had led her to this moment, the years of grief, the silence she had lived inside, the promises made on a cemetery lawn beneath a folded flag. She wasn't the same woman who had first picked up a pistol with shaking hands and an uncertain heart. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into the elite marksman's club and been treated like a joke. Tomorrow she would stand alone against someone who had every advantage money and influence could buy. Tomorrow she would be tested not just on her skills, but on her will, and she would not falter. Because real strength, the kind that mattered, didn't come from titles or trophies. It came from the promises you kept, the burdens you carried, the storms you survived. And Sarah Collins was a storm they would never forget. The morning of the competition dawned grey and cold, a thin mist curling over the city streets like restless spirits reluctant to leave the earth. At the elite marksman's club, the tension in the air was thick enough to touch. Staff bustled with a nervous energy they tried, and failed, to conceal, adjusting tables, double-checking score displays, reviewing safety procedures with a precision that bordered on frantic. Word had spread far beyond the usual membership. Today, the elite came not just to shoot or spectate, but to witness a reckoning. Invitations had been quietly extended to journalists, influential board members, even a few celebrities who understood that they weren't just attending a shooting match. They were about to see a story unfold, one that would ripple through their world no matter who emerged victorious. Sarah arrived alone, dressed in the same practical, simple style she always wore. Jeans, sturdy boots, a plain black jacket zipped up against the chill. She carried no fancy gear, no team, no entourage. Only a small duffel bag, worn at the corners, inside which lay Nathan's journal, her Glock, and the quiet, steady conviction that had carried her this far. As she walked through the glass doors, conversations paused. Heads turned. Some stared openly, some with thinly veiled contempt, others with open curiosity, and a few with something closer to hope, a silent, collective wondering if she could truly do what no one else had. Rebecca Hart met her just inside, clipboard clutched tightly to her chest. "Miss Collins," she said quietly, her voice low but firm, "there have been a few changes to today's event. Mr. Carrington requested some modifications to the standard rules, and the board approved them." Sarah nodded without asking for details. She had expected this. Logan would never fight on even ground if he could help it. Rebecca hesitated, then added, "They've weighted the final station more heavily. It will count for 30% of the total score. Long-range precision rifle, the Macmillan TAC 338. It's not standard issue. Only a handful of civilians have access to one, and Logan is one of them." Sarah absorbed this information in silence. She could see the worry behind Rebecca's professional mask, could feel the warning tucked between the words. Logan hadn't just set the bar high, he had built it in his own image, betting everything that Sarah would stumble the moment she stepped into unfamiliar territory. But Sarah smiled, small and steady, and said only, "Thank you for letting me know." Across the main floor, Logan made his entrance, flanked by a small entourage of assistants, sponsors, and PR handlers, his gear gleaming under the overhead lights. He wore the easy grin of a man used to winning long before the first shot was fired. His logo-emblazoned jacket was immaculate, his posture relaxed, his entire being calibrated to project dominance. When he caught sight of Sarah, he offered a mock salute, his smirk sharpening when she didn't respond. He turned his charm toward the assembled crowd instead, shaking hands, clapping backs, working the room like a politician on election day. By the time the competition began, the gallery was packed. The audience included veterans, professional marksmen, club members, and curious onlookers. Some leaned on the polished railings, some sipped coffee from silver thermoses, but every eye was trained on the two competitors as they took their positions at the first station. The rules were simple on paper but brutal in execution. 10 stations, each designed to test different aspects of marksmanship: speed, precision, adaptability, calm under pressure. All weapons provided by the club. No personal modifications, no excuses. Whoever accumulated the highest composite score would win. At the first station, the weapon was a simple 9mm pistol. Logan moved first, his shots rapid, clustered tightly in the center of the target. Textbook, professional. He stepped back with a confident nod, handing off the pistol with a flourish to the next official. The crowd applauded politely. Sarah took her place without ceremony, breathing evenly, adjusting her grip minutely. She fired more slowly than Logan had, each shot deliberate, each movement economical. When the target reeled back, her grouping was tighter, slightly but undeniably tighter. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Station after station, the pattern repeated. Logan was fast, aggressive, polished. Sarah was calm, measured, methodical. She adapted instinctively to every new weapon: semi-automatic rifles, old bolt-action hunting guns, a cumbersome pump shotgun designed more for show than efficiency. She didn't rush. She didn't posture. She simply delivered precision shot after precision shot, every movement a silent argument against the world that had doubted her. By the 6th station, the scoreboard showed Logan ahead by a razor-thin margin. A lead earned more by his familiarity with competition formats than by raw skill. But by the 8th, Sarah had narrowed the gap to a statistical tie. Spectators who had come expecting a spectacle now leaned forward in genuine fascination. They weren't watching a fluke anymore. They were witnessing mastery, the kind of mastery that couldn't be faked, no matter how many years you spent polishing a public image. At the 9th station, the pressure was palpable. A single missed shot could cost either of them the match. Logan wiped his palms subtly against his pants before taking the weapon. He fired quickly, aggressively, punching clean hits into the target, but one shot slipped just outside the inner ring. It wasn't a disaster, but it was a crack in the armor. Sarah stepped forward next. She took longer between shots, her breathing slow and deep, her body perfectly still. When the final shot rang out, the target returned, showing a perfect sequence of hits, everyone tucked neatly into the center. The scoreboard updated. Tie. Everything came down to the 10th station, the Macmillan TAC-338, a long-range, high-powered precision rifle customized specifically for Logan's personal use. The rifle gleamed under the lights like a trophy. Logan smiled broadly as he stepped to the bench, his hands caressing the weapon with a familiarity that was almost intimate. This was his domain: long-range shooting, specialized gear, the kind of technical expertise Sarah wasn't supposed to have. Logan's shots were good, very good. 9 out of 10 landed inside the bullseye rings. Only one drifted slightly off target, a minor flaw but not fatal. He stepped back, confident. He had set a bar so high that only a true expert could clear it. Sarah approached the bench. She immediately noticed the subtle sabotage. The scope had been adjusted off-center, the cheek rest tweaked just enough to throw her off balance if she didn't recognize it. Logan watched her closely, waiting for the stumble, the hesitation. But Sarah had spent the last week preparing for exactly this. She checked the adjustments calmly, made silent corrections based on the notes Nathan had once painstakingly written down for her. Tiny calculations for wind drift, elevation differences, subtle shifts in unfamiliar rifles. She remembered every lesson, every hour they had spent at the range with Nathan guiding her hands, teaching her not just to shoot, but to think like a shooter. She lined up her shot, took a breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle was sharper than the pistols had been, reverberating through the hall like a thunderclap. Sarah barely moved. The spotter called out, voice tinged with disbelief. "Bullseye!" Again and again. Shot after shot, Sarah delivered with machine-like precision, each hit tightening the knot in Logan's gut until he could barely breathe. When the final shot rang out and the target reeled back, the reality became undeniable. 10 shots, 10 hits, a perfect score. The room exploded into applause, louder than before, raw and unstoppable. People rose from their seats, clapping, shouting, some even whistling. Logan stood frozen, his face drained of color, the check he had written now burning a hole in his pocket. Sarah remained still, letting the noise wash over her, feeling none of the chaos penetrate her quiet center. She had kept her promise. She had fought her battle. She had won, not just against Logan, but against every whispered doubt, every closed door, every voice that had told her she was not enough. Rebecca stepped forward to announce the official results, but it was barely necessary. The crowd already knew. The truth had been written in every bullet hole. Sarah Collins, quiet, steady, unstoppable, had changed the elite marksman's club forever. And she had done it without ever needing to raise her voice.